Okay, well, why don't we start off with how Barnabas describes the mistaken arrest of Judas instead of Jesus.
Okay, maybe just to save time, I'll try to combine quotations with some summary on my own, but I'll indicate which one is quotation. For example, in the Gospel according to Barnabas, on chapter 214, I'll just give the chapter number easier, chapter 214, and it says, I quote, "Having gone forth from the house, Jesus retired into the garden to pray, according to his custom was to pray, bowing his knees 100 times and prostrating himself upon his face." And then he goes on in the rest of the chapter, indicating how Judas knew the place where Jesus was, went to the high priest and offered to deliver Jesus in return for 30 pieces of gold, how the high priest immediately gave the money to Judas and sent a Pharisee to the governor in order to fetch soldiers, and that a legion of soldiers were sent with Judas carrying torches and lanterns. And then he continues in chapter 215, and this I make direct quote, "When the soldiers with Judas drew near the place where Jesus was, Jesus heard the approach of many people. Therefore, in fear, he withdrew into the house. And the 11, he means the 11 disciples, and the 11 were sleeping. Then God, seeing the dangers to his servant, commanded Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and Uriel, his ministers, to take Jesus out of the world." That's where it differs from the canonized Gospels. "The holy angels came and took Jesus out by the window that looks towards the south. They bare him and placed him in the third heaven in the company of angels, blessing God forevermore." And then he continues, chapter 216. Some of these chapters are very small. "Judas entered impetuously before all into the chamber whence Jesus had been taken up. And the disciples were sleeping. Whereupon the wonderful God acted wonderfully, insomuch that Judas was so changed in speech and face." Notice this. Changed in speech and face to be like Jesus. "That we," that's the disciples, "that we believed him to be Jesus. And he," that's Judas, "having awakened us, was seeking where the Master was. Whereupon we marveled and answered, 'You, Lord, are our Master. Has you now forgotten us?' And he," that's Judas, "smiling said, 'Now are you foolish, that know not me to be Judas Iscariot?' And as he was saying this, the soldiery entered and laid their hands upon Judas, because he was in every way like to Jesus." The rest of the chapter he describes how the disciples, when this happened, they were just up from their sleep, fled, and then it says that how a young man was wrapping himself with the linen, ran away, the soldiers ran after him, so he left the linen and ran naked. By the way, that story is similar also in that particular part to the canonized Gospels, except that in Barnabas he identifies that young person as John. And then he describes how the soldiers took Judas, thinking that he was Jesus, bound him, and when he denied that he was Jesus, they started mocking him, and they told him that we are going to make you the king of Israel, and we are binding you because you are refusing the kingdom. So that's how the Barnabas version goes.
That's fascinating, actually. So they've arrested Judah, thinking that he was Jesus. Now, did Judah protest his arrest, and why was he actually not recognized as being Judah?
Okay, the clue that you can get from the previous chapter is that, as he says, the miracle that took place is that God changed Judas in speech and face to look exactly like Jesus. And in fact, Barnabas says that he actually protested that he is not Jesus but Judas, but they thought that he is just escaping the punishment and trying to pretend that he is not Jesus. For example, let me read you a little bit from chapter 2:17, just to see how Judas responded. It says, Judas answered, "Now, have you lost your senses? You are come to take Jesus of Nazareth with arms and lanterns as against a robber." Let me stop and make a comment here. You know that description is found also in the canonized Gospels, except that these words are attributed to Jesus rather than Judas.
Oh, I see.
But again, what Barnabas is saying that it looked like Jesus, but in fact it was Judas. But it's very similar wording you find also in the canonized Gospels. Anyway, "And you," Judas continues, "have bound me that have guided you to make me king." And then he describes how the soldiers lost their patience and started flouting Judas with blows and kicks, again similar to the canonized Gospels, except that it relates that to Jesus rather than Judas. And then it says, this one is a quotation, "John and Peter followed the soldiers afar off, and they affirmed to him who writes," that's to Barnabas, "that they saw all the examination that was made of Judas by the high priest and by the council of the Pharisees." And then he continues and says that Judas actually spoke many words of madness. But since the soldiers and other people believed that he was in fact Jesus, they thought that the fear of death forced him to pretend that he is mad, that the soldiers put a bandage over his eyes and smote him and started to tell him, "Well, if you're a prophet, tell us who smote you." They spat on his face. And then he describes how in the morning the council of scribes sought false witnesses against Judas, believing, of course, that he was Jesus. And that this was the feeling and the perception of everybody that knew him, that this was indeed Jesus, including the disciples, even though Barnabas in a later chapter describes how they came to know as to what happened. But at that time, everybody thought, his mother, his disciples, everyone else thought that it was actually Jesus who was arrested. And then he goes on, quote, "As God lives, he who writes," that's Judas, Barnabas, "forgot all that Jesus had said, how that he should be taken up from the world, and that he should suffer in a third person, and that he should not die until near the end of the world. Wherefore he went," he means Barnabas here, "he went with the mother of Jesus and with John to the cross." And then again he says that the governor himself asked Judas, he thought again he was Jesus, asking him to tell him the truth. It says, Judas answered, quote, "If I tell you the truth, you will not believe me." Let me make a remark here. "If I tell you the truth, you will not believe me." Very similar statement is found in the canonized Gospels but attributed to Jesus. It's very amazing, the kind of analysis. But here is something that is not in the canonized Gospels. He continues, "If I tell you the truth, you will not believe me, for perchance you are deceived as the chief priests and the Pharisees are deceived." That is, I'm not Jesus. And then it says that when they led Jesus to the governor and again insisted on him to tell the truth, he said, "I have power to release you, and I have power to put you to death." That Judas answered and he said, "I am Judas and not Jesus." And then it says that the governor went out to the masses, to the people, and he explained to them. And he said, "Listen, if this fellow who claimed not to be Jesus, if he is not Jesus, then it would be wrong for us to kill someone who is innocent." Okay? And if he is Jesus and he's denying to be Jesus, he says he must have assuredly lost his understanding, and it is impious to kill a madman. You see his argument. I mean, if it's not Jesus, it's wrong to kill him. If he's Jesus and is denying, he must have lost his understanding, so we should not really kill him for that. And then he says that the masses started to shout, no, he is Jesus, we know him. Of course, he looked in every respect like this. We know him. And he's trying to do that to escape from our hands. And then finally it says that Pilate tried to get rid of the problem by referring him to Herod, since Herod was the king of Galilee and Jesus was a Galilean. And then it says that when he was taken to Herod, he was also mocked. And Herod returned him back to Pilate with instruction, do not fail in justice to the people of Israel. So basically, really, yes, to answer your question, Judas did protest according to Barnabas, but nobody believed him because, after all, in every respect, the person arrested looked in face and speech like Jesus.
But if Pilate or Herod were told by Judah that he was not Jesus, then why was he not released?
That's an interesting question, but this similar question arises even in the canonized Gospels when they were convinced that Jesus is innocent, and still they put him to death or agreed to let him be crucified. But as far as the Barnabas explanation, he says that as far as Herod is concerned, he said that the chief priests and scribes had already given a good quantity or a good amount of money to Herod. And now, of course, to get rid of Jesus. Pilate also heard about that, so he hoped to get a piece of the cake. So he tried to pretend, he says, that he wants to set Judas free, or Jesus, as people believed him, free, in the hope that he might also get some money. Actually, Barnabas describes that, and that's in chapter 217, quote, whereupon he caused him, that's Pilate, he caused him to be scourged by his slaves, who were paid by the scribes to slay him under scourges. But God, who had decreed the issue, reserved Judas for the cross, in order that he might suffer that horrible death to which he had sold another. It means he had sold Jesus. In other words, God is punishing him of the same kind. He wanted Jesus to die this death, but God decreed to hold him, that he would not die under scourges, but to be reserved for the death on the cross. That's Barnabas' version.
How does Barnabas describe the crucifixion of Jesus?
In one sense, I found it to be quite similar to the canonized Gospels, except for the identity of the person who was crucified. For example, those who are familiar with the New Testament, of course, would identify very easily with this description. He says that Judas was mocked. He was dressed in an old purple garment, very similar. That the soldiers started to bow to him in mockery and greet him as the King of the Jews. That they placed on his head a crown of thorns, very much like the canonized Gospels. They put in his hand a reed for a scepter. He says that when the chief priest and the Pharisees noted that Judas did not die under the severe scourges, they were afraid that the governor might set him free. So they gave him a gift of money to give Judas to them so that he may be crucified along with the two robbers. And then this part, maybe I quote it directly, it says, chapter 217. So they led him to Mount Calvary, where they used to hang malefactors, and there they crucified him naked for the greater ignominy. Judas truly did nothing else but cry out, God, why has you forsaken me? Seeing the malefactor has escaped and I die unjustly. So in one sense it's very, very similar for anyone familiar with the Gospel to the same story, except that it says that it was Judas, not Jesus, who was crying on the cross.
What was the reaction of the disciples to the crucifixion?
Barnabas gives that description also continuing in the chapter 2:17. That's perhaps one of the longer chapters. Usually in Barnabas they are short, very short chapters, but that one is quite extended. He says that the followers of Jesus were very much in confusion, for they felt or believed that the one who was crucified was Jesus. Let me quote directly from Barnabas on this. He says, "Verily, I say that the voice, the face, and the person of Judas were so like to Jesus that his disciples and believers entirely believed that he was Jesus, believing that Jesus had been a false prophet, and that by art of magic he had done the miracles which he did." That's some of the disciples or some of the followers. "For Jesus had said that he should not die till near the end of the world. For that, at that time, he should be taken away from the world." So that's a description, or you might say, reaction of some of those whose faith was a bit weak. They saw or thought Jesus was crucified, so he must have been a false prophet. But in contrast to that, he said there are those who stood firm in their belief. These people were really in great grief, and they were weeping constantly. And then through the intermediary of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they were able to obtain the body of Judas in order to bury it in the new sepulchre that was built by Joseph, after they wrapped him in 100 pounds of precious ointments. So in that sense, again, that part of the description is very much similar again to what you find in the canonized Gospels. And all of them believe that it was actually Jesus.
Now, if Judas was the one that was crucified, how does Barnabas explain the empty tomb on Sunday morning? Like, what happened to Judas' body?
Okay, very good. He addresses that issue also. He says, following the crucifixion, everybody went to his house, and that Mary, the mother of Jesus, along with Barnabas, the writer of the Gospel, John, and James, went back to Nazareth. And then he says, I'd like to quote that directly, because that's a sensitive issue. It appears in chapter 218 of the Gospel of Barnabas. Quote, "Those disciples who did not fear God went but not by night and stole the body of Judas and hid it, spreading reports that Jesus was risen again, whence great confusion arose."
I see. Okay. Now, does Barnabas speak also of the appearance of Jesus, may peace be upon him, after he was saved from the cross?
Yes, he does. Actually, he says that the news, when the body of Judas, as he says, was stolen, and the news, spread around, he said the news reached Nazareth. So Mary, who was already in Nazareth, came back with John, James, and Barnabas to Jerusalem in order to find out what's happening, and they were very in great grief. And then it says that the angels communicated this information to Jesus, peace be upon him. And then it says, and I quote, that's in chapter 219, "Wherefore Jesus prayed God that he would give him the power to see his mother and his disciples." And then he goes on and says that God ordered or commanded the angels to carry Jesus to the house or to the place where his mother was, and to watch over him for 3 days, and that he should not be seen except by those who really believed in his doctrine. And then he continues that Jesus, having got the permission from God to come back again and appear before his disciples, that he came back surrounded with splendor to the room where Mary, the two sisters of Mary, Mary the Magdalene, Martha, Lazarus, John, James, Peter, and Barnabas, these 10 people, 5 men and 5 women, that Jesus came to them. He said that when they saw him, they fell as dead. But he lifted them, and he says, "I am Jesus. Don't cry, because I am alive, I'm not dead." Let me give one direct quotation here. It says, "Then the Virgin Mary, that is, weeping, said, "Tell me, my son, wherefore God, having given you power to raise the dead, suffered you to die to the shame of your kinsfolk and friends, and to the shame of your doctrine? For everyone that loves you has been as dead." Jesus replied, that appears in the following chapter, 2:20. Jesus replied, embracing his mother, "Believe me, mother, for verily I say to you that I have not been dead at all, for God has reserved me till near the end of the world." And then he explains, that's Barnabas, how the angels explained to Mary what happened to Judas. So that was the first time that Barnabas and his companions realized what happened, the transformation of Judas to look like Jesus and to be put in his place on the cross. I found that a very interesting and fascinating story. You know, the way the consistency of the story goes. It's just amazing.
It is very fascinating, and we'll pick up on this point next week, inshallah. Thank you very much for joining us here in Islam in Focus. Any questions or comments would be most appreciated. Our phone number and our address will be appearing on your screen. From all of us, Assalamu alaikum. Now, is there any trace of this gospel before Kramer found it?
You mean before 1709?
Yeah.
In fact, a famous Christian scholar by the name of George Sale, who actually made a translation of the Quran, mentioned in that introduction something more about the origin of the gospel. And he says that the original discoverer actually of that gospel was a Christian monk by the name of Fra Marino. Fra, F-R-A, Marino, M-A-R-I-N-O. And he said that this took place in the later part of the 16th century, perhaps around 1585 through 1590. And that was obviously before Kramer discovered that in Austria. So that means that the gospel must have passed through a number of hands before it reached Kramer in Austria. According to Sales, he said that this monk, Fra Marino, accidentally saw some works or a book written by Irenaeus, the famous person who was regarded as heretical in the early church, who lived actually between 130 and 200. So you talk here about the 2nd century mainly. In that particular document, Irenaeus speaks against the teaching of Paul. He opposes the ideas introduced by Paul, and he based his objections by way of authority on the Gospel of Barnabas. So that monk, Fra Marino, became very curious. What is that gospel, the Gospel of Barnabas, that Irenaeus has been referring to a long time ago? It happened that once that monk, who was a very intimate friend of the reigning Pope at that time, Pope Sixtus the Fifth, he was visiting with him, and he was, since he is a very close friend, intimate friend, he was sitting with the Pope in the personal library, inner, library of the Pope. And he said that while they were sitting there, the Pope fell asleep. So Fra Marino, the monk, in order to occupy himself, tried to reach down for some book to read. And to his pleasant surprise, the book that he held was the gospel that he has been hoping to find and has been looking for, the Gospel of Barnabas. The monk could not resist the temptation to hide that book in his sleeves. And when the Pope woke up, he simply took permission from him, took leave that he's leaving, and went out with that treasure in his sleeve. According to George Sales, he said that he read the Gospel, and discovering that it mentioned Prophet Muhammad by name, that is to come after Jesus, he actually embraced Islam. Again, I'd like to emphasize that this is the version or explanation of George Sales. I'm not saying it is mine, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is his historical trace of the Gospel prior to its finding in Austria, that it must have been in the Pope's library. But whatever the case may be, whether the story is right or wrong, the fact of the matter is that there is a physical evidence in existence that at least it can be traced to 1709, the Italian copy, and it's still in existence in the Royal or Imperial Library in Austria, and that's where we get these photos.
Mm-hmm. Now,
it's open for examination.
You told us earlier that the church considered the Gospel of Barnabas as an apocryphal gospel. Now that's interesting, and I'd like to ask you, why is that?
The reason why they consider it apocryphal or unauthentic, there are a number of reasons, in fact. First of all, because the Christian creeds, as we know it today, seem to have been shaped largely by the teachings of Paul and his interpretation or understanding of Jesus, peace be upon him. Perhaps much more so than the straight, simple words of Jesus himself. I mean, if one look at it, in the New Testament has very little from the direct words of Jesus. The rest is mostly the explanation of Paul, who wrote almost half of the New Testament literature, about 13 books. The simple teaching of Jesus was simply to invite people to repent and to worship the one God that he himself worshipped. Jesus worshipped, just like all other Israelite prophets. However, in his introduction to the gospel, as we have seen little before, he was very critical of Paul. Barnabas is very critical of Paul, as we have seen, and that seems to give a more logical reason for the split and difference between these two important men. The problem here is not only in Barnabas' severe criticism of Paul, who is regarded by many as the second founder of Christianity, if not even the main founder of Christianity. Christianity that is based on the notion of Christ or Christ event than historical Jesus himself. But the difference also is that the Gospel of Barnabas is very similar to the canonical Gospels in many details, in many stories. However, significantly different in some creedal aspects. And these differences, I believe, are very important, that it could probably shed light on early Christianity and how it developed, and potentially even might provide answers to some pressing and important questions.
Well, that's quite interesting. Going one step from that, maybe I'll ask you to elaborate on that, and specifically about the similarities and the differences between the canonical Gospels and that of Barnabas.
Okay. I'd like first of all to indicate that from the quantitative standpoint, in terms of number of verses, we can say that the Gospel the Gospel of Barnabas is very much similar to the canonized Gospels, especially with respect to the teaching of Jesus, his sermons and spiritual teaching. There's many other historical details also are very similar. So that's not necessarily a major issue. But despite of the similarities of the general stories of what happened to Jesus and his mission, we find at least three important differences. First, Barnabas does not speak about Jesus as either God or Son of God, but as a prophet and messenger, a holy prophet and messenger of God. Remember when we read the introduction the very title of his gospel, he says, again to read, "True gospel of Jesus, called Christ, a new prophet, sent by God to the world, according to the description of Barnabas, his apostle." So that is quite revealing, and that's consistent throughout his entire gospel. He speaks about Jesus as a prophet. And as such, he considers all other theological arguments that came later on to deify Jesus as something extraneous to the teaching of Jesus, something that was added on that was never taught by Jesus. Perhaps I should give an illustration of that. In chapter 70 of that gospel, chapter 7, maybe if I read that, it might give some idea. The chapters, by the way, are very short, usually about 1 page each or so. And at the end of chapter 69, it describes how the Roman soldiery, by the working of Satan, he says, began to stir up the common people, saying that Jesus was the God of Israel who was come to visit his people. From the beginning of chapter 70, he responds to that. He says, "Jesus departed from Jerusalem after the Passover and entered into the borders of Caesarea Philippi, whereupon the angel Gabriel, having told him of the sedition which was beginning among the common people," that is to consider him deity, "he asked his disciples, saying, What do men say of me? They said, Some say that thou art Elijah, others Jeremiah, and others one of the old prophets. Jesus answered, And ye, what say ye that I am? Peter answered, Thou art Christ, Son of God. Then was Jesus angry, and with anger rebuked him, that's rebuked Peter, saying, Begone, and depart from me, because thou art the devil, and seekest to cause me offense. And he threatened the 11, that's the 11 disciples, saying, Woe to you, if ye believe this, for I have won from God a great curse against those who believe this. And he was fain to cast away Peter. Whereupon the 11, that's the other 11 disciples, besought Jesus for him, who cast him not away, but again rebuked him, saying, Beware that never again thou say such word, because God would reprobate thee. Peter wept and said, Lord, I have spoken foolishly. Beseech God that he pardon me. Then said Jesus, If our God willed not to show himself to Moses his servant, nor to Elijah, whom he so loved, nor to any prophet, will ye think that God should show himself to this faithless generation? But know ye not that God hath created all things of nothing with one single word, and all men have had their origin out of a piece of clay. Now, how shall God have likeness to man? Woe to those who suffer themselves to be deceived of Satan. And having said this, Jesus besought God for Peter and the 11, and Peter weeping and saying, So be it, so be it, O blessed Lord our God. Afterwards Jesus departed and went into Galilee, in order that this vain opinion which this common folk began to hold concerning him might be extinguished.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating, and it is indeed a very powerful statement made by Barnabas, in which he seemed to negate any notion that Jesus accepted to be deified, or that he was the Son of God. A second main difference is that, according to Barnabas, he says that Jesus was not crucified, but the one who was crucified in his place was Judas the Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, the description of that is quite detailed. I cannot read it like chapter 70, because it appears in about several chapters, 9 of them perhaps, from chapter 214 to 222. Instead, I'm just giving a very brief summary of the events of crucifixion. First of all, he says that when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, the angels carried Jesus away. Then he said that Judas entered into the room where the 11 disciples were sleeping. And he said at that time God changed the face and speech of Judas, and he looked exactly like Jesus. To the point that when he was looking for Jesus and saying, "Where is the Master?" the disciples were confounded. They say, "You are the Master." And then he says that when the soldiers took Judas and then unbound him, he protested that he is not Jesus. So they started to mock him and beat him up and told him mockingly that we're going to make you the king of Israel. Perhaps we can stop at this point, because there are additional points perhaps that relates to the story of crucifixion. I'd like to both continue the summary in the next program and perhaps give a few quotations.
Inshallah. Thank you, rush through this. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Badawi, and thank you all for joining us here in Islam in Focus. As always, your questions and comments would be most appreciated. Our phone number and address will be appearing on your screen. Hope to see you next week, inshallah. From all of us, Assalamu alaikum.